On September 30th, 2022, Ludum Dare 51 took place, and the theme was announced as every 10 seconds. I was at work when the theme was announced, so I had a good amount of time to write down ideas and core features, and eventually I decided on a sci-fi FPS horror game, where you're a space pirate and your goal is to board procedurally generated ships and scavenge for resources, and eventually make it out of the galaxy. The plan was to have the player board the ships completely blind, and over time, at every 10 seconds, tell them more and more about the ship that they're on. This would mean the player would have to tread carefully and quietly, since you're not sure what living creatures are on board. Are they sensitive to sound, vibration, light? Who knows? I think the idea is pretty neat, but obviously was way too ambitious for a 48-hour game jam. And I could have opted for the 72-hour jam version, but I still thought it was too ambitious. So instead of scrapping it and making a different game for Ludum Dare, I decided I'd pass on the game jam for now and start working on this as a small project instead. This is how the game looked after about 6 hours of work, which is all I got to put into it. Pretty atmospheric, but also lacking any resemblance of gameplay. So let's fix that. Since I'm not limited by a very short time period of 10 seconds anymore, the first few things I did were related to the pace of the game. I made it so information about the ship takes longer to research, and originally for the game jam, I wanted to keep the game under 10 minutes, that way each person's experience would be bite-sized and they wouldn't be hindered by slower, boring pacing. But since I'm also not limited by the game jam anymore, I scrapped the objective system completely and opted for a more survival horror approach. I didn't want each ship to feel linear in any way at all, and I wanted the player just to explore and do what they wanted and not have their hand held. Then I added a little text notification when the game starts so the player knows that research is being conducted, just for a little more feedback. And then I kind of just blanked. Like, I didn't really know what to do. Sure, I knew all these features I wanted to add, but like, which one am I going to start with? Like, where am I going to start? There's so many. I figured I'd start with the system that would allow the player to collect certain objects to obtain metal scrap, which is probably one of the main resources in the game. I have no idea. I made it so the repair tool can do more than just repair stuff. It can collect things, it can take items, stuff like that. The little text box tells you what you can do with whatever you're looking at. It's pretty cool. I also made it so it's more obvious when the repair tool is being used by making it shake a little bit and then lean in towards the center of the screen while you're using it. I also wanted the player to be able to pick up different kinds of gear and equipment and then either be able to sell them or use them in some way. This could be things like weapons or player upgrades or ship upgrades, stuff like that. So I made a really simple inventory and made it so you can pick up any object that you want, as long as it's an item. Each item has a certain weight to them, that way you can't carry like a million things at once. And I made the notification play a different sound effect if you attempt to pick up an item and it's too heavy for you. Pretty sweet. Eventually, I'll add the ability to drop items, but right now it's not that important. Next, I really wanted to get started on some basic AI, so I proceeded to make the most terrifying capsule I could ever conceive. Yeah, pretty freaky. I made some particles for when you shoot him, and then some sound effects go along with it. Then I added headshots that deal twice as much damage. And then I added a really questionable ragdoll. It kind of looks like they just like fall over and go to sleep or something like that. It's kind of weird. Next, I started making a really simple state machine for the enemies. It only has 3 states at the moment. It has Wander, Chase, and then Patrol. Wander tells the AI where to move around to. Chase is like for targeting the player, and Patrol tells the AI where to look if they lose sight of the player. So they go to the last spot they saw the player in and kind of just look around there. I imported an old script that I'd used in my Army Man FPS game for line of sight, and I used that for the aliens. And after I got that to work, I made it so they'll track the player and patrol to their last position and all that stuff. And now that the enemies have a few brain cells, I wanted to start working on different detection systems for the enemies, like light and audio and stuff like that. Audio was the easier choice of the two, so I decided to make that one first. The way it works is that every audio clip that's played has an intensity amount that scales from 1 to 10. The higher the intensity, then the louder the sound is. Then I use that intensity value to determine whether or not the enemy should be alerted to it. So for instance, shooting your gun is really loud, reloading your gun is a little quieter, and then your footsteps are nearly silent. Each sound can have a different intensity, so for example, shooting the assault rifle is much louder than shooting the pistol. It works pretty well. I made it so the enemies let out like an ear-piercing screech when they hear a sound, like to alert the player that they're in danger. And then I realized that adding sprinting would just be like a good thing to add now, since I have this audio system in place. Currently, there's just normal walking and then slow walking, which makes your footsteps silent. Sprinting is way louder than normal walking, so you take the risk of alerting like a lot more enemies while you're running around like a chicken with its head cut off. And while I was at it, I completely replaced the slow walking with crouching, since I felt like it fit more with the game. Once that was done, I decided the gun sounds could use a bit of a facelift, so I got rid of the old sounds that I made for Ludum Dare and made new ones completely from scratch for shooting and reloading. Next, I focused on adding the light detection system for the enemies. It was actually pretty easy to make. I just reused the field of view script that I'd used for the enemies and just had to tweak the code a little bit. The range and size of the light detection cone always follows the light you tell it to, so it makes editing it really easy. And the way it works is when an enemy is detected in the cone and it stays in the cone for a certain amount of time, it alerts the enemy and then they start chasing after you. And according to the lore, these guys can't see certain colors of light, which means I can have some pretty cool mechanics around different light colors. In this case, I made the repair tool have a red flashlight that won't alert enemies, so you can stare at them for as long as you want. This whole system regarding light and detecting it is still super bare bones right now, but in the future I'll update it more and make it so the enemies react to light more believably. But regardless of its complexity, it's still another system that affects the gameplay in a pretty huge way, so at this point I realized that I can't really get any further with any gameplay mechanics that I add without having like an actual environment to test them in or like any sort of real level. So I decided it was time to finally start delving into the procedural generation that I wanted for the levels of my game. And this isn't going to be some like zero to hero moment where I go out of my way to learn a ton of different algorithms to make the levels. No, not at all actually. I've always been really bad with procedural generation, and the most I've ever made using it was for an underwater game I was making. It was like Minecraft voxel style terrain with biomes and stuff, but despite my interest in classic roguelikes, I've never actually made my own dungeon generation system. Usually I get too frustrated and kind of just like move on to something else. I looked through the asset store for some generation assets, but none of them are really what I wanted for my game, so that's when I decided to go look through YouTube just to see. And that's when I came across this video by Vazgriz. I used his code for my level generation, so go watch his video and follow him on Twitter or something. And his code's on GitHub if anybody wants to use it. After I downloaded it, I loaded up his project and I made some modifications to stuff like room size and setting a random seed, and then I made an editor script so I can generate levels without having to be in play mode. And it worked pretty well. The hard part was done. The base of the level generation was done. So thank you, Vazgriz, for your awesome video and providing your code in GitHub. It helps a lot. Again, go follow him, please. So now that the hard part was done, aka the algorithm, I moved on to actually making rooms and hallways be accessible to the player so they can walk around inside of them. This was a fairly simple process since every piece of the map, every cell is on a grid, so I can just make modular pieces and basically build the levels that way. It ended up taking like a lot longer than I thought it would, but after a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and like 4 or 5 hours, I finally got it working pretty well. And I'm pretty sure I made backrooms but in space, like on accident, but it looks pretty cool. It's really weird. Then I made it so hallways only connect with any given room once, that way you don't end up with weird cases like this where a huge part of the room is exposed because of the hallway. And earlier on I made it so hallways would be flagged as either restricted or unrestricted, or pretty much just, is this hallway a door or not? Is it going to be a door? And I basically determined it by whether or not the hallway tile was either the first tile or the last tile in the pathfinding sequence. And so the first and the last tile always marked as doors, and then everything in between was marked as a regular hallway. And this was used to determine where doors would be placed. And then also it obviously would tell the walls where to be placed, so you don't place walls in front of doorways. I came across this issue where rooms sometimes wouldn't have any doorways connecting to them, and I think it's a mixture of my code and the original code. I think what happens is that pathfinding for hallways ignores already made hallways, and then it overrides the tiles that it had marked for doorways. I fixed it by letting rooms that have no doors pick a hallway around them at random and then mark it as a door. So now every room is going to have a door, they just have to decide which one they want. And this is what the current state of the level generator looks like. It's pretty cool. Pretty happy with it. At this point, even though the levels were still really barren, I thought it'd be pretty cool if enemies could spawn. Since I'm already using Unity's built-in nav mesh, I decided to just incorporate the experimental package that lets you bake the nav mesh at runtime. It took a little while to get it working, a lot of crashes and stuff, and trying to debunk code, but I think I got it working pretty well. And then I made it so enemies could spawn in the rooms, which is pretty cool. Just seeing them walk around and traverse the environment. It's pretty sweet. Now I could really start to see where this game is headed after I put the enemies in, because even though they're super basic and pretty dumb, it's still really eerie and honestly pretty terrifying, especially you can hear them running around and they open doors around you and you shoot something and they start screeching and they all start running towards you. It's pretty fun. It really is. It's pretty scary too. This is all I've gotten done so far, but next time I plan on furnishing the rooms, adding props and stuff like that and shaping them, adding different kinds of enemies, new weapons, a whole lot, so Stay tuned for that. But for now, here's a little bit of gameplay of the current state of what the game is at right now, just so you get like a little feel for it. So enjoy.